Shalom lekulam, shalom everyone. Welcome to another webinar of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. Today the webinar is on the Syria crisis. As you all know, we have many people with us. May I mention that there are many from the Friends of Tel Aviv University, also from the Mary Gallison San Diego Israel Initiative. I see some people from embassies and from other organizations. So welcome everyone. My name is Amos Nadan. I'm the head of the center of MDC, which is the largest by far Middle Eastern research center in Israel. As always, this is an opportunity to thank, in fact, the friends from the advisory board for encouraging us to organize these English language sessions. Basically, each speaker here would speak for about 7 minutes on specific topic, to be followed by a Q&A. And please feel free to submit them using the Q&A function in this webinar. The speakers, all of them academics that involve in a pro-academic analysis. And these are the speakers, Dr. Joel Parker, that would speak about the Syria context. After that, Dr. Yahel, Dr. Omri Eilat. I will present each of them very shortly before they would speak. Dr. Arik Rudnitzky, Dr. Ofra Bengio, Professor Ofra Bengio, Dr. Eytan Cohen Yanarocak, Dr. Brandon Friedman, and Dr. Chelsi Mueller. Before starting, a quick reminder, in the last 655 days, there are hostages in Gaza, and we hope and pray to see them as soon as possible. The Middle East changed dramatically since the beginning of that war on October 7th, but there are also major significant continuities, and we will see part of them today. So in a kind of continuity, everyone, of course, claimed victory. Non-victorious leaders have problems to survive, and therefore you can see that everyone declares that they just won the war with or against Israel. There is a clear winner here, at least if we speak about welfare analysis, which is Israel. Israel won from Gaza to Tehran, from Lebanon to Syria, although in our own perspective, from time to time, we wouldn't define the situation in Gaza as a victory. Still, there are two open areas of significant fightings which Israel is involved. One of them is Gaza, the other one is the Houthis in Yemen, and now, of course, this case of Syria also evolved. But what we see today specifically is a war after that war. So basically, people are trying, and countries are trying, and also organizations are trying to put themselves in a better position in the day after. And this is true for Gaza and Syria, that specifically we will discuss today. And in the day after, sovereign countries like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, and other countries wants especially to have stable neighbors, stable borders. So if we look at Syria, this was the hope at the beginning. Like Trump, you remember, had a kind of agreement with Ashara to control the country, to have a stable state. But at the end of the day, what we see is that Syria is still very unstable, and this is exactly what we would speak about today. One of the problems of the instability is internal unstable structure. And we see that in Syria, we see that in Lebanon, in Yemen, in the Palestinian Authority. The source of instability is basically the structure of the country. And we would see today how mixed and problematic Syria is. Additional problem, and we would speak about that today as well, is that there are states that ideologically, they don't see their borders as their dream of expansion. We saw that in Iran. Now we'll see some changes, and probably Dr. Chelsi would speak about that. And we would see significant change, I believe, in Turkey, as Hai would suggest. If you read Arab newspapers, Israel is also an actor that, in fact, brings instability to the region. So if we look at ourselves as a stable country, a stable stability, we are usually being discussed in this misleading kind of framework of imperialism, of countries that want to conquer more and more. And this is, as you will see today, part of the analysis in the Arab world of Israel today acting in Syria and, of course, acting in Gaza. But as it may sound weird, there are still big hope, specifically in those stable states, for Abraham Accord to be expanded. And people speaks about it from time to time. And the deadline or the buffer zone is basically to move to a kind of ceasefire. And in many cases, people would speak about peace or a kind of negotiation towards peace between Israel and the Palestinians. But the war is not over yet. And as I said, there are people who try to gain more. One of the gains would be after the war is that countries would try to normalize relations with Israel. And we see that today on the unofficial level. Now, I'm watching much news feeds and so on from Syria. As you'll see today, the players that we're trying to describe are in many cases not so clear-cut. You speak about the Syrian army, and then you realize that within that, there are also tribes that, in fact, murder their opponents, the Druze. So I think that we'll see that later on as well today in the discussion. I think that it's a good time to move forward and to ask Joel Parker, Dr. Joel Parker from the Moshe Dayan Center, to give us some context. Joel.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that introduction. I'm the first one to go, so I have the disadvantage of not knowing what everyone else thinks. So I have to go with my own gut feeling on the issues. And the truth is, as Amos said, there's a lot of room for interpretation on these issues. We still haven't figured out, the dust hasn't settled yet. The conflict is still alive right now in southern Syria. And I've been focused mainly on the area of Sueda, which is the largest Druze populated town in the world, actually. The Druze are a relatively small minority. It's an ethno-religion, so meaning they have a religion, but they marry in amongst themselves. So they've kept their identity for centuries. And they live in 4 countries: Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And they don't really live in, except for the diaspora, they don't really live in concentrated numbers anywhere else in the world. So the two main actors, so I'm going to break this down. The 2 main actors really right now in the conflict we've seen in the last week or so are the Druze and the Syrian government. Now, I won't take too much time on the Syrian government because my colleague Eitan is going to speak about that in a minute. But between the Druze and the transitional government, we have a concept here that most of you can understand. We have tension between the idea of whether the Druze should have more autonomy or whether they should be more integrated into the Syrian government. And this dilemma actually exists, is a discussion within the Druze community itself. And it's a discussion and a negotiation between the Druze and the central government. Now, there's a third actor that I want to explain that's in the mix, which is the Bedouin population of southern Syria. And in recent days, especially, well, actually in recent months, the tension that's come to the surface has been mainly between one part of the Druze community and some of the Bedouin community that live in a semi-nomadic way in southern Syria. And so the Bedouin of southern Syria and the Druze have had this clash. Now, what does the clash mainly revolve around? It revolves around this, this road, the Sueda-Damascus highway. Excuse me for one second. And so that's been something that, that we've been focused on, is this Damascus-Sueda highway, and trying to figure out whether the Druze can have free access to Damascus if they don't want to actually be fully integrated with Damascus. And this is something that the government has tried to use as a bit of a tool to create leverage. The government has set up checkpoints in the last few months, mainly manned by local Bedouin tribes. And these checkpoints have been designed to essentially slow down the Druze populations coming from near the border with Israel over to Damascus. And some of that has been certainly excessive. Some of it has been abusive, because there's been even some cases of targeting the Druze for their religion. And there's been recorded cases of them making fun of their religion, persecuting them, and even in some cases using violence. And it's led to an increase in violence between the Druze and the Bedouin tribes, who are really, in my opinion, acting as kind of tools of the central government. So the Druze have two major factions right now. One, which is, as I mentioned in the concept, one is pro-integration with the government, and one is very skeptical of the Syrian central government. Now, the transitional government led by Ahmad al-Shara, who comes from this organization, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which is essentially a Sunni Islamist jihadi organization. And the Druze are very skeptical of his intentions towards them. And I say the Druze in general, but I mean, really, there's one faction headed by the Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri, who's been the spearhead of the kind of skeptical group of Druze. And his men, armed men, they're a militia, have actually several factions as well. And some of them were previously allied with the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which makes them extremely suspicious of the new government, but also vice versa. The new government is extremely suspicious of them, not just because they're Druze, but also because they have, in some cases, ties to bad actors in the Assad regime. So we have this tension between some of the Druze who definitely do not want to be integrated into the state, and some of the Druze who are more interested in being part of the state. And that group has actually, in recent days, fallen out of favor with the majority of the Druze. So it's important to note that the pro-regime side of the Druze seemed like it was the dominant side. And now, after all the violence, they've lost a lot of their footing. The majority of the Druze I know in Syria are very skeptical of the government now. And so the skeptical side has gained ground. And I know I have to finish soon, but I want to mention the Bedouin for a second. The Bedouin it's actually a smaller group than the Druze in the southern Syria. There's only about 35,000 Bedouin among a population of around 700,000 people in southern Syria. So they're a relatively small number, and the reason why they're in the front spotlight is because they have been part of this semi-official coalition guarding the road between Sueda and Damascus. So then you have what happened was, in recent days, because of the violence between the Druze and the central government, you had also violence between the Druze and the Bedouin, which sparked a wider call for the tribes to come and join the fight on behalf of the government. And that is a very complex picture, but what we had is tribes coming from eastern Syria down to help the government essentially quell this Druze rebellion. And this created a lot of violence. And in fact, many people were kidnapped on both sides, including both Druze kidnapped by the tribes and tribal factions kidnapped by the Druze. And we're still in this situation right now where we have kidnapped people that are held on both sides, and the government is not able to control the situation. And that's, I think, a good segue to Ido, who will tell you a bit more about the government and why its management of this conflict has been so unsuccessful.
Thank you very much, Joel. We'll now move to Ido Yahel. Ido is a postdoc fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center. Ido.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for joining. So, Joe, I will surprise you, but I will say that I think if we will compare this event to a boxing match, I will say that Ashara won it by points, and not by knockout, but with points. And I explain why. So I think this event that started as a local event, as a local feud between the Druze and the Bedouins, Ashara took it as an opportunity to expand his control, as Joel said, to expand his control over Asweda. His goal is to expand his control over the entire territory of Syria, including the minority territory, the Kurds, the Druze areas, and he tried to use the chaos in order to portray himself as the only one who is able to restore order. So I think at the end of the day, as the dust settled, and I agree with Joel that the dust still didn't settle, so it's still very early to make like all of the conclusions. But I think as of today, he is the victor of this event. But I will start with the negative developments. First of all, his move didn't really work out as he planned. So he put the army there. The Syrian army and the Minister of Defense invaded Sueda, and he was met with strong resistance by Israel, right? He miscalculated the Israeli response to the military entrance into Sueda. So the military was forced, and the Minister of Defense were forced to withdraw, and the only government officials now in those checkpoints that John mentioned are actors from the Interior Ministry and not the Defense Ministry. So basically, sovereignty is still very, very limited. Another thing that the crisis proved that he has a very limited control over his allies. So his allies are quite independent, and they pursue some independent policy. And at the end of the day, there is also, I read a lot of Sunni anger towards Ashara that they didn't go all the way against the Druze, including, by the way, some of the people in the Ministry of Defense and some of his allies has a very jihadi background. So at the end of the day, they can turn against him due to this anger. And we see today that this anger is really much alive. And another thing that is very important is his ability now, after these events, the prospects of minorities will integrate into his own government, into his new Syria. I think is very much, the prospects are very slim today, because just, I don't know if we'll talk about it, but just an hour ago, the speaker of the SDF, the Kurds in Syria, said that in light of these new events, they will not hand over their guns to the Syrian government. So his endeavor to include all minorities within his government, I think, received a very, very strong blow. But why I said that, despite this, I still think that he won this episode by points. First of all, let's talk about the fact that there are members of the Interior Ministry in Sueda today, not inside the settlements, but in strategic checkpoints, in strategic crossroads. And this erode the demilitarization of this area. One of the purposes of Israel, beside protecting, if you accept Israel narrative that the bombing was in order to protect the Druze community there, but it's also to ensure that this area will remain demilitarized. And the presence of people from the Interior Ministry erode this agreement, erode this arrangement. And it's a step for another, maybe bigger and more substantial security presence in Sueda and southern Syria as a whole. But I think most important is that everywhere else, everywhere that it is not Israel, besides Israel, everyone look at the Shara as the only legitimate ruler of Syria. Right? Let's talk about the region. During the events, all Arab states, all of them, issue a statement that condemns every external intervention that compromised Syria territorial integrity and sovereignty, and demanded that Ashara will be give the opportunity to restore calm to the area. And more important is another, I will use another sport analogy, is that Israel received a very bright yellow card from the United States in a very undiplomatic manner, right? The Secretary of State Rubio said that the United States is very, very disturbed by the Israeli bombing. And just yesterday, the Speaker of the White House said that President Trump was taken by surprise by the Israeli attack, and he asked Netanyahu to amend it. So the United States pretty much, just like Israel tried to limit Ashara behavior in southern Syria, also the United States put a lot of limitations on Israel policy there. And I talked about the bad publicity, the fact that many people, so it looked bad, right? That so many people, 200 people were executed by Ashara forces, according to the Syrian sources. But even people who mention it, like Rubio and the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, said that Ashara is responsible for holding the perpetrators accountable. So he is still, even after the massacre, even after at least 200 people were murdered by his own people, he is still considered by the free world or the West as the person who is responsible to revise it, to correct things. And to finish, just a few hours ago, the inquiry committee of the March events, the massacre of the Alawites in the coastal area, they published their initial results, and I think you won't be surprised to learn that they claimed that Ashara and the Syrian government was not found responsible for the events, but other people who tried to undermine the authority of the central government. So I believe in a few months from now, when the inquiry committee will publish its conclusions about the current events, we will see pretty much similar conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ido. Our next speaker is Dr. Omri Eilat. Dr. Omri Eilat is the only one that officially is not from the Dayan Center, but practically is also part of the Dayan Center. We have a close collaboration with the Research Institute at the Druze Heritage Center of Israel. And Omri is from there. And of course, from University of Haifa as well. Omri?
So, do you hear me? Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Nadan. There's a lot to tell, and things happened since the morning or yesterday. So I'll get straight to it, and forgive me for being more hawkish and bring the some of the Druze outlook. So we are after 10. We are now. There is a very fragile ceasefire. Events are likely to continue after 10 days of clashes. In the Druze, the Druze overview on these events is that, of course, they never trusted Ashara and never trusted him, that they had experience. This is not only how the guy is talking or who were his mentors. They have experience from the civil war, long experience from the civil war in Syria, and they had no expectations from this regime. But right now, this is no longer in the Druze outlook. This is no longer a regime or HTS versus the Druze clash. This is 13 district against one district in Druze outlook. So it made them more cohesive. Israel was the only one who aided them. And we have to describe it in the harsher words that it deserves, because the violence against the Druze, who were very limited before then, and there was a sort of a siege even before then. They were very limited in movement before these events. So now we're talking about there is genocidal violence over there, and it's backed by religious ideology, takfiri, against them as heretics. So it's ideological, it's organized, and in the Druze, I mean, there is no. This is very fragile now, because it is beyond mistrust between the Druze and the regime. So when I have to make some order here, because the only argument within the Druze community in Syria, who are more than half of the Druze in the world, are not only in Sweda but in many more villages in Mount Horan. So the real argument between them is not whether to integrate or not to integrate, because even those who want to integrate, there is absolute agreement not to hand the weapons. So, and the regime demands to hand over the weapons, and this is something that even the opposition to Hikmat al-Hajari, they are not willing to do so. So in the event, they began as clashes between the Druze and the Bedouins. The last real clashes, the last serious clashes between Druze and Bedouin tribes were in the year 2000, and then the Assad regime was an arbitrator, but now the regime joined the Bedouins, and it became the regime, the HTS versus the Druze. And it's not like the regime is something very organized now. So the regime is militias, and there are Bedouin militias, and there are claims, and the practices, the practical tools were quite the same. So many Druze that I talked to, they claim that they were jihadists disguised as Bedouins or tribal units supported by the state, by the regime. So basically, Israel attacked between 14 and 16th of July, attacked the heavy weapons of the regime, and the heavy weapons, the tanks and the cannons, they retreated. And then since then there are tribal units who attacked after the Druze avenged and executed some Bedouins in these days of the first ceasefire. So and this is what we have since then. We still have, this is still unclear what is the death toll. There are hundreds of dead. Many Druze we know from the outskirts of Sweda, they were evacuated to central Sweda, where there are many more Druze fighters. The problem with the Druze fighters that they act in small squads. I mean, we have top 10 people in 10 soldiers in each squad, and there is no central command. So this is the central operational problem that the Druze had. But we can see that as a result of the events, I mean, politically, Hikmat al-Hajari was the dominant figure before the events as well. Hikmat al-Hajari is the spiritual leader of Sweda, and he is an office holder as well. In Sweda, he is the central religious authority. He is the more separatist, the more pro-Israeli, and he has connections to Israel as well, familial connections as well. And and he has some other Jarbu and the Hinawi. They are religious. They're part of they have religious authority, and this is quite much the Druze, especially in Israel, see it as a personal opposition. But they are definitely not pro-regime. They can be anti-Israel. They are not pro-regime. And the closest trigger to the regime is Laith al-Bal'ous, whose father was killed during the civil war by the IRGC, and he is closer to the regime, and he is said to was promised to inherit Hikmat al-Hajari. So the dominant figure and office holder among the Druze in Sweden. But right now, after, probably we have to see, but probably the Druze public opinion in Syria, it became more cohesive. People got closer to the Hikmat al-Hajari outlook and perception, and this is they saw what the regime did. They had experience. This is not the first massacre of the Druze. We had massacres in the civil war in Jabal Sumak, and it was by HTS in northern Syria, in Jabal Sumak, and in the Druze mountain there was a massacre of over 200 people, casualties during the civil war by ISIS after Bashar al-Assad led them to act there. So I'll get to Israel and what, because Israel is definitely a factor here. This is not something new, that relations between Israel and Druze in Syria or Lebanon, they shape the relations between Israel and the Druze within Israel, and the Druze community in Israel is the strongest one right now. Historically it was the weakest one. It is the smallest one. It is the smallest community, and right now it presents the most successful model. So there is a connection. It's since the 30s. The Druze in Israel will be the bridge to it, and I can see how Israel will keep being involved in the Druze affair in Syria, and we'll have to find the way to do so without clashing with American interests. And that's it for now. So thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Omri. We'll move to Arik Rudnitzky, who would in fact follow the discussion and would connect the discussion to the Druze community in Israel. Arik is the head of the Konrad Adenauer program at the Moshe Dayan Center. His main research, or the main research of that program, is the Arabs in Israel. Arik?
Thank you, Amos, and thank you all for joining us in this webinar. I want to shed the light and focus on what is going on within the Druze community in Israel, and to ask the question whether the Druze in Israel play a factor in the formation of Israel's Syrian policy. Now, to tell you something, that earlier today, I went to the north of the country. I met a group of young Druze leaders, and you simply cannot imagine how the events in Syria actually tear the Druze community apart. Not that you can find different camps in this event, but it really has a sense that it actually happens here. Now, the question is why is this situation, and how can we understand what is taking place in Syria and the effects of what is going on in Syria on the Druze community here in Israel? Now, with your permission, I would like to share several slides that will make this clear. Now, we here at the Konrad Adenauer program, we held several public opinion polls throughout the war. And here, what I want to share with you are findings from the Druze sample in several public opinion polls conducted by the Konrad Adenauer program, asking them to say or to mention what is the most important component of their personal identity. Now, in front of you, you see the shift of the emphasis of each component in the identity. You see that while at the beginning of the war or in early phases of the war, the Israeli citizenship was by far the most important component of the identity, while the Druze religious identity and the Arab identity were to a less extent important. Today, and this is as of our most recent poll, we see how the religious affiliation or the religious identity grew stronger as a result of the events in Syria, beginning in the regime change in late December and up to the current crisis in Syria. The poll was carried out before the massacre of Sweda, so I think that you can imagine now how important and how the balance between the different components actually keep on changing. The thing is that we have to also bear in mind that citizenship and religion play a significant role in determining the Druze identity in Israel. And being a Druze means something for your personal identity as you absorb it from your early childhood, as you grow up to believe that you belong to an imagined community. If we want to take the Benedict Anderson's paradigm, speaking about imagined communities. The thing is that what we also have seen in the course of the war, that one of the Druze religion, they have 7 commandments. One of the most important commandments is known in Arabic, Hifz al-Ikhwan, protect your fellow believers. And this is evident to a large extent during the current crisis in Syria. Here, what I want to share with you are findings from a comprehensive poll conducted among Druze in May. This was not carried out by the Konrad Adenauer program, but I think that these results are relevant to our case. Well, you see that significant parts of the Jewish community say that Israel has to intervene and provide aid to Syrian Druze in the times of distress, mostly humanitarian, but also a military intervention is on the agenda. Now, this is as far as the Druze community is concerned. I will stop share and I want to focus on the Israeli policy. We know that Israel welcomed the Ashar regime with mixed feelings, and some of them believe that he is actually a former jihadist, and the question remained, what should Israeli policy be with regards to the new regime in Syria, and how should Israel act with the Druze case in southern Syria? Now, I'm not an expert about Israeli foreign policy or Israel's Syrian policy, but what I do want to mention here is the Druze factor actually in shaping Israel's Syrian policy. And I think that much influence in this contributing to the Druze factor in Israel's consideration, much contribution is attributed to this man, Sheikh Muwafaq Tarif, He is the spiritual leader of the Druze community in Israel, and he has been very active in the past months, even before the regime change in Syria, but even more so after that, both on the Israeli political arena, and also on the international arena and in the Arab region arena. And it is no incident that, according to the recent poll carried out by the Konrad Adenauer program, some 60% of the Druze community in Israel consider him to be the most influential public figure, even though he is not a politician. This thing actually distinguishes the Druze in Israel when we compare them to other Druze communities in Syria and in Lebanon, where there is no, I would say, agreed upon leadership. Now, the Sheikh has been very active, and this is one factor that Israel has to take into account. But also what Israel must take into account is this fact that within Israel, there is a growing unrest within the Druze community, owing to several internal processes that are taking place since 2018, since Israel endorsed this, the Knesset passed the nation-state law. These pictures actually were taken from the summer of 2023, some 3 or 4 months before the October war actually broke out. Now, to conclude, and this is what I want to bear in mind. While Israel's Syrian policy, of course, Israel has its own interests with intervention in Syria, also the Druze in Israel becoming one of the most influential Druze community in the Middle East definitely help shape the Israeli Syrian policy during this crisis.
Thank you very much, Arik. We'd now move to Professor Ofra Bengio from the Moshe Dayan Center. She would speak about another significant minority in Syria, not only in Syria, the Kurds. And if you follow out on different short videos that are being sent from people from the military of the Syrian, you would see some of them saying, okay, the next are the Kurds. So it's time to move and to speak about that minority as well. Ofra?
Yeah, the situation and the role of the Kurds in post-Assad Syria resembles that of the post-Saddam Iraq. Like the Kurds in Iraq, those of Syria have the following advantages over the other communities. First of all, they have behind them 13 years of self-rule, which make them stronger than the others. They are better organized militarily, having fought Daesh and won the war in that war. They have a charismatic leader, Mazloum Abdu, whom we hear each time about his achievements, most importantly of having built an autonomy out of scratch. In their autonomous region, they managed to form alliances with Arabs, with Turkmens, and with Assyrians, which we don't see in any other place. Numerically speaking, they are much outnumbering, of course, the Druze, but they are alike the Alawite rulers of the past. So in this case, they have much more power than the other communities, of course, the Druze. The Kurds of Syria have managed to form alliances also with the West, especially with the United States. And now we know that there are still some 2,000 soldiers or others in American in Syria. And this is an important deterrence, not just for Turkey, but also for Damascus as well. They are far from Damascus, so it's difficult for Damascus to reach them as they did the Druze. Like the Kurds of Iraq, they demand a federative solution and a governmental system in Syria. And like the role of the Kurds after the collapse of the Ba'athi rule in Iraq, so in Syria too, the Kurds may become peace enablers. Already now we know that the United States approached Abdi in order to tell him to maybe to start calming the region, the southern region. We don't know if they did not say yes, but this is very interesting to look at. They also, another very important point, the so-called dismantled PKK are finding their way to Syria. There are sources saying that there are already 2,000 PKK fighters in the Rojava, in Kurdistan of Syria. So this is very important support to the Kurds of Syria. But this rosy picture should be balanced by other disadvantages, of course. The first is that the Kurds in Syria are facing three major enemies: Turkey proxies, and of course, Daesh. In this sense, the situation of the Druze is much better because they have support of a neighboring country, namely in Israel. The other point is that unlike the Iraqi case, the US and the West stick with the idea of forming a nation state, and they do not want to hear about any federative solution, which really makes difficult such a possibility. We know of Tom Barak's speeches, who is all the time speaking about this nation state, Syria, which in my opinion is illusory and imaginative. Also, being an offspring of PKK makes the situation of the PYD, the other sister group in Syria, vulnerable. Like the PKK, they are sometimes designated as terrorist groups, and Turkey turned them into a main target for killing two birds with one stone. The so-called peace process between Turkey and the PKK might have negative impact on the Kurds of Syria, and we will see how things are going to develop. Looking at the future very briefly, we can see the following hurdles. On the whole, in Syria, the model of the nation state, which has developed in the Middle East, is totally different from the European model. It is anti-democratic, totalitarian, and illiberal. And rather than share power with the minorities and integrate them in the system, they treat them as sheer enemies. Both in Iraq and Syria, a unifying national identity was slow to develop. Hence, the minorities continue to grant priority to their ethnic or religious identities. The Americans and the West in general are deeply involved in the craft making of the new regime in Syria. They seek to manufacture a new nation state based on the Western model. Hence, they give priority to an imagined nation state at the expense of minorities. One would think that if now majorities are ruling both in Iraq and Syria, in Iraq the Shiites and in Syria the Sunnis, they would be more generous in sharing power with the other groups. But it did not happen in Iraq, and I doubt that it will happen in Syria as well. Finally, the culture of political violence has become part and parcel of Syrian society, all of which doesn't bode well for the future. Thank you.
Ofra, thank you very, very much. We now move to Dr. Eytan Cohen Yanarocak. By the name, you can figure out that he was born in Turkey. I think that it's very important now to speak about Turkey, because if you look at the news, it seems that Turkey is not there, while I believe that I would argue that Turkey is indeed there and lead some of the activities that we think that they are not led by the Turks. Hi.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for having me on this distinguished platform. Today, I would like to present you the Turkish perspective, how the things are seen in Ankara. I have some news for you. They are very different from Israel. From the Turkish perspective, the Ankara government sees this recent clash, or let me say, this unrest in the Druze mountain in Syria, nothing else but an Israeli plot. In their opinion, Israel orchestrated this whole violence through the Druze community in Syria. In their Turkish media outlets, they are tagging these Druze communities as useful instruments of Benjamin Netanyahu. And needless to say, they are demonizing the state of Israel. And of course, the Israeli government headed by Benjamin Netanyahu. They are arguing that the Israeli government is led by messianic decision makers who are trying to pave the way for an apocalyptic war. And therefore, they also truly believe that Israel is making all of its decisions in accordance with a imaginary conspiracy theory called the Promised Land Vision. In their opinion, Jerusalem takes all of these decisions, including launching a total war against Gaza and occupying some portions of Lebanon and Syria in order to proceed. And, you may be surprised, but from their perspective, their ultimate, in their opinion, our ultimate goal is to occupy some segments of the Turkish territory. And they really, truly believe in it. So in their part, from their perspective, the defense of the Turkish territories are starting within the territories of Syria. And therefore, approximately an hour ago, the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan had a press conference. And there he said, I'm quoting what he said, if you take the steps for dividing and destabilizing Syria, Turkey will perceive this as a direct threat to its national security, and we will intervene. We will act. So this is a clear message, of course, for Jerusalem. But when he was asked further to elaborate, we can say that Turkey, we can say what Fidan said. He said Turkey will not allow Israel to realize its agenda together with the other countries in the region. And therefore, I would like to provide you a very important information here. Last March, the Turkish Foreign Ministry initiated a very important step in Jordan. They formed a new alliance called the Neighbors of Syria Alliance. The 5 states, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, they formed a joint command center. And when they are asked, they are saying that this command center was organized against the ISIS. But let me tell you, ISIS is the fig leaf. The main agenda is to create a military deterrence against the state of Israel. So between the lines of today's statement of Hakan Fidan of the Turkish Foreign Ministry, we can clearly see that he is still very much believes in this Neighbors of Syria pact. And regarding the Druze, as I said, the Turkish government is tagging the Druze as useful instruments of the state of Israel, but they are trying to distinguish the Druze between the Lebanese Druze and some segments of the loyal Druze inside Syria. So basically, the faction of Hikmet el-Hijri is tagged as a Zionist collaborator, let me say. And of course, needless to say, that the current American administration's policy that it's headed by the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack, is also strengthening Turkey's stance vis-a-vis Israel and of course, Turkey's position in Syria. I would like to remind you that Mr. Barak adopted a very pro-Turkish stance regarding the unitary nature of the Syrian state. You know, it's very absurd to hear from an American that he does not believe in a federal state, but rather a unitary state. You know, this is really ridiculous. But at the end, what we are seeing is the Turkish government and the Turkish media is ignoring the atrocities and all of these crimes that were committed by these Sunni jihadists against the Druze. And when you're opening the Turkish TVs, you're seeing the exact opposite, as if the Bedouin tribes in the Suweda province, as if they were the victims of this separatist Druze groups. Of course, we know the reality from the field itself, because we obviously do see what is happening there. And obviously, in Turkey, they are also not aware of this social dynamic between in the Israeli society. They are not aware this special bond between the Jewish people and the Druze people. They are not aware that the Druze citizens of Israel are considered a kind of this is a very brotherly relationship. And since these people are contributing to our state, since these people are, I'm summing up. Since these people are contributing to our security, and they are paying taxes, and they are contributing to the national security of the state of Israel, we can definitely say that Israel is doing the most important thing. But of course, by taking this action, we are also declaring the end of the probability of reaching an agreement, of the Abraham Accords agreement with the El Julani government. And let me tell you, this is my last sentence, the biggest winner here is Erdogan, because with this incident, he is also capable of putting an end to the potential Abraham Accords between Israel and Turkey. And let us also not forget about the militias of Uzbek, Uyghur, and Turkmen militias who brutally killed the Druze in Syria. Of course, this should also be highlighted. Apologies if I talked a little more than I supposed to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chai. Indeed, as you can see here, Turkey is beyond much of the scenes in Syria. Would now move to two versatile speakers. Last time, Chelsi Mueller spoke about the United States, and Brandon Friedman spoke about Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. So now, Dr. Brandon Friedman, the head of research at the Moshe Dayan Center, would speak about the United States, and after that, Dr. Chelsi Mueller would speak about Iran. Brandon.
Thank you. I'm going to make 5 brief points about the United States, but also about Saudi Arabia, and it really connects to Hai's last point, because I think the United States has been working hand in hand with Saudi Arabia on this initiative to push normalization between Israel and Syria. But before I make those points, I just want to say 2 things. First, the violence in Syria between the Druze, the Bedouin, and the tribes and government forces has been brutal and barbaric, and we haven't seen this kind of violence since the end of the war in Syria. And so I think first and foremost, we need to be modest about our own assumptions and our own assessments at this stage. There's still a lot we don't know, and certainly we should all feel for those Druze the innocent Druze who've paid with their lives in the last 10 days or so. So my 5 points about Saudi Arabia and the United States. when the violence between the Bedouin, the Druze, and the government forces erupted, all of the talk, both in Israel, but also to a certain extent elsewhere in Washington as well, was about this initiative to get the Syrian government to normalize with Israel. And the United States and Saudi effort was designed in part to stabilize Syria, if you wanted, plays to the ambitions of the US president to bring peace to the Middle East. But I think most importantly, the two sides were strategically interested in locking Iran out of Syria. Iran had been expelled from Syria in December 2024, and it is a shared strategic interest of the al-Shara government, but also of the United States and Saudi Arabia, to keep Iran out of Syria. And to a certain extent, the Saudis feel that al-Shara is the lesser of two evils. They're not entirely comfortable with al-Shara and his jihadist background, but they prefer al-Shara to an Iranian-backed government in Syria. Secondly, the Saudis really would like to see an Arab Syria, and this relates to points made by Professor Bengio about the Kurds. The Saudis would like to see an Arab Syria that's unified under Arab leadership. They fear a weak and divided Syria that ultimately would be vulnerable to Iran. So it relates to the first point. That's the Saudis. The Americans' position towards events in recent days has been interesting. The US Special Envoy to Syria, the ambassador to Turkey, who I alluded to earlier, said the Syrian government is capable, competent, trustworthy, and has delivered on all of its promises without committing mistakes. Well, that would seem to be a very rosy view of the al-Shara government. Nevertheless, that appears to be the Trump administration's position, and certainly one I'm sure that many here in Israel are not entirely comfortable with. If you contrast that quote from the US Special Envoy to Syria with leaked comments that were reported yesterday, referring to the Israeli Prime Minister as a madman who bombs everything all the time, this is a troubling state of affairs, you might argue, between Israel and the United States. There seems to be a gap with respect to this issue, one that parties on both sides should be mindful of closing. Finally, my last point, Faisal Abbas, who is the editor of the Arab News and a prominent spokesperson, unofficial for the Saudi government, wrote in a recent editorial that Syria is not just a country, it's a geopolitical keystone. Its collapse would send tremors through Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and the Gulf. The region cannot afford another failed state, especially one that borders Israel, Turkey, and Iraq. And I think that represents the position of both the United States and Saudi Arabia at this stage to a certain degree. And finally, I'll finish with a question. It relates to the comments I made about Turkey. I would say, looking at the events over the last 12 days, it's important not to forget the intra-Sunni rivalry here. The American and Saudi initiative to get Israel to normalize with Syria threatened to marginalize or reduce Turkish influence with the al-Shara government and to bring al-Shara closer to the Saudis and the Americans, and perhaps indirectly to Israel, something I imagine that in Ankara they're not particularly happy with. And so it's worth bearing in mind the events over the last 12 days, that there is still some degree of competition within the Sunni sphere for influence over the Shara government, with Turkey probably hoping to see al-Shara remain a client of their government, while the Saudis and perhaps others wishing to pull Shara a little bit away out of the clutches of Ankara. I'll just leave that question out there about where this intra-Sunni rivalry remains today as probably an issue we should continue to follow very closely. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Brandon. And we will now move to Dr. Chelsi Mueller, who would speak about Iran.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Syria under Bashar al-Assad was a client state of Iran for decades. It was a vital land corridor to the Lebanese Hezbollah, which has been the most important member of Iran's regional axis. And given Syria's importance to the Iranian regional axis, The fall of the Assad regime in December was really a tremendous blow for Iran, but it was part of a larger process that began after the 7th of October, during which the so-called ring of fire that Iran had built up and invested in for years around Israel was significantly weakened piece by piece. And that process also then culminated in the strikes on its nuclear program during the 12-day war. So the question that I set out to answer is, given all that's happened, how are events in Syria being viewed in Iran today? The Iranian foreign minister and other spokespersons are saying that Iran supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. Iran actually views the violence in Syria as a vindication of its efforts to prop up the Assad regime during the Syrian civil war. An article in the Kayhan says that Syria, quote, hasn't had a single happy day since Assad left. And then it goes on to depict the December revolution and the rise of al-Shara to power as the product of collaboration between Turkey, the US, Israel, and Azerbaijan. And here the inclusion of Azerbaijan is interesting. Iran's regime has become very suspicious of Azerbaijan, which is on its northern border, believing that it was complicit in the blows that it received during the 12-day war. But Iran ultimately places the blame for the violence in Syria between the Druze and the Bedouin squarely on the shoulders of the regime, which is interesting because it seems Israel has articulated that same view. And I saw in the Iranian media the regime being referred to as a terrorist regime, as a savage regime, as a totalitarian regime. And one Persian language article went so far as to say that the images of the crimes that the Syrian regime has committed make the hairs of every free person stand on end. And then it goes on to say that compared with what's going on in Syria, what goes on in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights looks very natural. I found that interesting. A different Kayhan article describes al-Shara as a stooge of the US and of Israel and of England. There is an Arabic language Iranian media outlet, Al-Alam, which can be interesting because it can give you a sense of what Iran is trying to communicate to Arabic speakers in Syria. They are blaming Israel for creating sectarian tensions, but placing a greater responsibility on the Syrian government, saying that its intimidation of the Druze created the pretext for Israel to intervene. So from Iran's perspective, the worst offender and the real cause of the crisis is the al-Shara regime. Al-Alam published an interview with a Lebanese informant who depicted what happened to the Druze as part of a trend that began with first attacks on the Alawites, and then the Kurds, then the Christians, and now the Druze. I think that Iran doesn't want to see a consolidated Sunni Salafi regime in Syria that would be close to Turkey and to Saudi Arabia. Iran wants to prevent al-Shara from consolidating power and would rather see Syria divided and weak. But Iran doesn't want Syria divided in a way that serves the interests of Turkey and Israel. And I think we should take a lesson from what Iran did in Iraq after the fall of Saddam and during the US occupation of Iraq, when Iran was very willing to feed grievances and fan the flames of sectarian hatreds. So the question is, how could Iran work to stir the pot in Syria, especially given the hurdles it faces in reclaiming influence in Syria? I think right now is a moment of Iran trying to figure out what its relevance is in Syria. So just a few ideas. Could it leverage its connections to the Syrian PKK? Could it embolden the Alawites to create provocations? Would it try to escalate discord between Israel and Turkey? What role might its misinformation apparatus play? There is an Iranian proxy which has a presence in the southern region that we've been talking about, which resembles Hezbollah, Uli al-Bas, which means the possessors of might. And it operates in the south, and it's engaged Israel in a couple of different occasions and lost some fighters. There's also Iranian-supported Islamic resistance militias in Iraq that can move through the porous border between Syria and Iraq. which the US patrols. I had a student who was part of that patrol there who told me that the patrol really didn't enforce, but rather was just there to deter and to observe. They were not authorized to use force to stop the flow of people and contraband. So the border there is porous, and Iran does have the Islamic resistance militias in Iraq that it could deploy. And while they're not leading actors, these different groups that I've mentioned do constitute some levers that Iran could pull. And I think that Iran favors a divided Syria, but not one that tips the balance toward Turkey or Israel, which I think is the main concern right now. And I'll end it there.
I see that I have a problem with my video, so I'll hand it to, yeah, here it is, to Jonathan Franco. Jonathan Franco is a postdoc, Dr. Jonathan Franco is a postdoc fellow at the Dayan Center, and he collected several questions. Jonathan, we don't have much time, so if you can direct few of them to different speakers.
Yes, thank you, Amos, and thank you all the speakers for this very interesting talk. As Amos mentioned, I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut short on the questions to keep us on time. And so I'm only going to ask some of the speakers questions. Apologies for that. Ido, I would love to start with you. It has been reported, we were asked about this, it has been reported that Israel and Syria resumed their indirect talks. How do you believe the current violence between the states and the Druze Bedouin dispute is likely to affect these talks at all?
So I was skeptical about these talks even before, that they will lead to certain like normalization between the states. But now I think it's pretty much impossible. If you follow the rhetoric, so the Syrian government rhetoric towards Israel became very harsh. It referred to it as Israel before the events. Now it is called the occupation regime, the Zionist regime, and also the Syrian Fatwa Council just said issued a statement that forbids any kind of normalization with Israel in religious terms. So I think the prospect of normalization is very slim, but the states still have a common interest security-wise, especially the hostility toward Iran and the interest to prevent any Iranian penetration back to the states. So I think the direct talks can lead to certain agreements in this regard, but obviously the violence reduced any chance to, I think, to true normalization between the states in the current, in the foreseeable future.
Thank you for that. Not very optimistic, but
sorry.
Yeah, but you're giving us the truth. What can we do? Ofra, I would like to move over to you. Can you talk a bit about the relations between the Kurds and the Druze community in Syria? Do they work together? Are they working separately?
Okay, before the collapse of the Assad regime, there were almost no relationship, both because the Kurdish entity itself was very new and because there is no contiguity between the Kurds and the Druze area. However, after the collapse of Assad regime, there is now a kind of idea of, the minorities coming together to build a kind of federal state. So we know that there are some connections between the Kurds and Druze, and there is this new idea, which I think it is imaginative, but it might happen as well, namely what they call David Corridor, to link between the Druze area straight to the Kurdish area of Syria and Kurdistan of Iraq in order to involve them in the Abraham Accord, the Kurds in the Abraham Accord. But, these things are still in their very small space. And actually, the United States asked the Kurds, who are stronger, to support the Druze. But as we know, there is very little cooperation so far. But the main idea is to build this imaginative state or federal state with all the minorities, Alawites, Druze, and Kurds.
And thank you very much for that. Brandon, I'd like to move over to you. Does the Trump administration currently continue to some degree the Biden administration policy of collaborating with the Kurds of Syria? And if so, how does that sit with the American hope to see Damascus stabilize?
Thanks for the question, and I certainly don't mean to rain on Professor Bengio's parade with respect to what's possible for the Kurds and Druze in Syria, but it would seem that the American policy is not particularly friendly towards the Kurds. And I'm sure the Kurds are quite used to this, because the Americans, apart from partnering with the Kurds on the battlefield, have not been particularly kind to the Kurds in terms of politics. If anything, I think the Kurds have learned how unreliable American political policy can be with respect to the Kurdish issue. Clearly, the Trump administration statements supporting basically the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria said there is no plan B when it comes to al-Shara, that he is it. That sort of explains the administration's current policy, which is to put all of its eggs in the al-Shara basket, which suggests it's not considering the alternative, which is a more loosely federated Syrian government. And Professor Bengio and I both heard Professor Shurko Kermanj articulate what I think is probably the most accurate expression of the U.S. interest in Syria, which is the U.S. wants to see the Kurds on the inside of the new Syrian government to help balance the al-Shara government and perhaps provide some measure of constraint on how the al-Shara government addresses minorities in this new federal Arab Syria that the Americans are backing, much the same way the Americans wanted the Kurds on the inside of the Iraq government that they helped to build. The downside to that vision is that it hasn't worked particularly well in Iraq, and it doesn't seem to be working particularly well in terms of Syria. So the American interest is to have the Kurds on the inside of whatever they're trying to build in Syria, similar to what they built in Iraq. And there's not really, at this stage, a whole lot of reason to be optimistic about the outcome.
All right, thank you. I would like to close with Chelsi. Chelsi, could you elaborate a bit on the demographic, the sectarian religious background of the Iranian partner that you mentioned in Syria, Uli Abbas?
Sure. First of all, the group is rather new to me. I haven't been studying them for a long period of time. And as I understand it, they're also a bit mysterious to the analyst community. We know that they've changed their names a few times. Their name formerly was the Islamic Resistance of the South. And now they've changed it to the Islamic Resistance Front in Syria, Uli al-Bas. They don't affiliate with a particular variety of Islam, at least not publicly, that I was able to find. They identify as a quote-unquote faith-based revolutionary nationalist movement. It seems they combine Islamism with nationalism, which is intriguing. So I'm interested in learning more about them. I know that they operate in the Daraa province, the south part that we've been talking about, and where Israel is also involved. So that's the nutshell on what I know about this group.
Thank you. With many not so optimistic observations, I'm handing back to you, Amos.
Thank you. I hope that we'll be able to be more optimistic in the future. But currently, this seems to be the situation. according to the expert that just spoke here. I would like to thank all the speakers and also to Timur Lichtman, who is with us, to Tali, Tony Marco, and to Tal Shachar Sofer, that without them, nothing happened in the Dayan Center. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and good night. Shalom.